Okay, so multiplying integers. All right, so we're going to talk first off about multiplying one positive and one negative number. Now, by the way, the rules are very easy. We'll get to them in a minute. I'm going to try to get you to understand what's going on. So in our first example, we have a positive 4 times a negative 3. Agreed? Positive 4 times a negative 3. All right. You might remember this. A positive times a negative is a... Do you know the result? Whenever you multiply a positive number times a negative number, the product is always a... It is a negative. We need to talk about why that is the case and how that ends up. Now, before we do that, I want to go back to kind of an elementary way of thinking of multiplication. So, way back, I don't know when you started, maybe 3rd grade. I don't think 2nd grade they teach multiplication. Maybe 4th. But your teacher would have said something like this. Sally, or probably class. 4 times 3 means 4 groups of 3. Oh, maybe she had cookies or something that show you how to multiply. That's basically what's going on. So I want you to take your green, and under the 4, I want you to write 4 groups. 4 groups of, that looks like grow-ups. 4 grow-ups. 4 groups. Put those letters together. 4 groups of, and in this case, we have negative 3, right? So we have 4 groups of negative 3. Isn't that what multiplication is? Right? If you have 4 times 3, you have 4 groups of 3. What do you get when you have 4 groups of 3? We all know the answer is 12. Well, in this case, we have 4 groups of negative 3. So, what is this? What's actually going on? Well, we need to write 4 groups of negative 3, which means negative 3 plus negative 3, there's a second group, plus negative 3, that's a third group, plus negative 3, that's a fourth group. Right? 4 groups of negative 3. Does that make sense? So now let's add it. What's negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3? Negative 12, right? We end up with 12 negatives, which we know to be negative 12, right? A positive times a negative is a negative because you're figuring out how many groups of those negatives you have. 4 times negative 3 is exactly the same as negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3. 4 groups of negative 3. That's what's going on. And this positive times this negative gave us a negative. In the second example, it's the same situation, right? So in this one, we have what? 3 groups, right? And 3 groups of what? Negative 7, right? So in this one, it's the same as negative 7 plus negative 7, there's my second group, plus negative 7, there's my third group. Does that make sense? 3 groups of negative 7. And negative 7 plus negative 7 is negative 14 plus 7 more negatives. And we end up at negative 21, right? And so we see that a 3 times a negative 7 should be easy for us to get that answer. Easy. All right, well, what if it's the other way? What if the first one's negative and the second one's positive? Okay, we can get there as well. Watch. A negative 4 is the same as the opposite of, so class, what's the opposite of negative 4? 4. This is exactly the same as the opposite of 4 groups of, and what do we have? The opposite of 4 groups of what? No, I don't see any negative 3. Do you see a negative 3? I want the opposite of 4 groups of 3, right? The negative gives you the opposite of, the 4 gives you the 4, and the 3 gives you the 3, right? The opposite of 4 groups of 3. So how does this one go? Let's keep the opposite of, and I'm going to abbreviate OPP for opposite, of, how do you do 4 groups of 3? That's 1 group of 3, 2 groups of 3, 3 groups of 3, 4 groups of 3. Right? I have the opposite of 4 groups of 3. Keep thinking. Next line. So now we have the opposite of, and this doesn't take a rocket scientist, but 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 is 12. Agreed? So now for our final answer, tell me what the opposite of 12 is. What's the opposite of 12? Negative 12. Don't forget opposite numbers. We learned them in the beginning of the year. Opposite numbers. One's positive, the other's negative. So look, a negative 4 times a 3 is exactly the same as the opposite of 4 groups of 3. That ends up being the opposite of 12. And what's the opposite of 12? Negative 12. And that's what's going on. Again, it's so much easier to multiply them. I'm just trying to get you to see why the answer is negative. That's all I'm after right now, is for you to believe that a negative times a positive is a negative. And that's why I need the opposite. Here's a negative again times a positive. So I want the opposite of 2 groups of 11. Right? That's what I want. The negative sign says the opposite of, and then I have 2 groups of 11. Give me the opposite of 2 groups of 11. Let's use ditto marks for the opposite of, right? Save a little bit of time. So what would you write in green next? Somebody raise your hand and tell me what to write the green part. What would the green part be next? If you're following what's going on, if you're thinking, look, and again, I'm going to say this, I'll say it 1,000 times. If you're a copier, you're learning nothing. If all you're doing is sitting at your desk and copying, you're learning absolutely nothing. You have to be a thinker. Abigail? Well, tell me what to write in green. I already have the ditto marks means the opposite of. Now I need to write the green part. So what do I write for the green part? 11 plus 11, exactly. So Abigail did 2 groups of 11, right? Because that's what we have, the opposite of 2 groups of 11. So then we understand that that's the opposite of 22, right? And therefore our answer is negative 22. A negative times a positive is a negative. Look, these aren't hard, and don't make them hard. They're not supposed to be. So let's boil it down to this concept. A positive times any negative is a negative every time. And a negative times a positive is a negative. Now you can't mess, if you miss these, you're going to miss them all. Some people like to say it like this. If the signs are different, then the multiplication is negative, right? You got 1 positive, 1 negative, different signs negative. 1 negative, 1 positive, different signs negative. Didn't all 4 of our examples end up negative as the answer? Didn't they? And we did a positive times a negative twice, and we did a negative times a positive twice. And it's always negative. So look, if you know this, it's real easy to do problems. So a negative 3 times a positive 11 is going to equal
Negative 33.
negative times a positive is a negative, and 3 times 11 is 33. That's a negative 33. I mean, piece of cake. Right? It's easy to multiply positive and negative numbers. Question, Michael?
Will you ever have to make these absolute value then the answer becomes positive?
They could give you something like that and put it inside an absolute value, at which case then the next step would look like this. Now you're ready to take the absolute value, and therefore the answer would be 33. So it's possible to get an absolute value question like that. But we're not worried about absolute value right now. We're just looking at multiplying a negative times a positive and a positive times a negative. So class, what's the answer to F?
Negative 35.
Negative 35. Right. Again, you need to be thinking. Don't say anything yet. Look at G. On 3, I want you to give me your answer to G. Everybody participate. It's on your paper. It's on the screen. It's on your paper. On 3, give me the answer to G. Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Negative 24.
Right? Because a negative times a positive is a negative, and 6 times 4 is 24. Look at H. All right, give me your answer to H.
Negative 36.
Negative 36. Again, wait for me now. Look at I. Look at I. Miyagi says, look, eyes. All right, give me the answer to I.
Negative 40.
Negative 40. You guys don't know who Miyagi is? All right, getting old. Karate Kid movie from way, way back. All right, negative 40. All right, and J don't say it yet. What's J going to be? Here we go on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Negative 24.
Easy, right? Multiplying positives and negatives is really easy. If you remember, positive times a negative is a negative, negative times positive is a negative. All right. Let's go to the next thought. What if you multiply two negative numbers? What if you multiply two negative numbers? How does this turn out? And again, I'm trying to get you to understand why something is what it is. All right, well, this one's a little interesting. To figure this one out, first off, we got to do the negative sign, which is the opposite of. The opposite of. What number is next, class? What's right after that minus sign? No, 3. So I need the opposite of 3 groups of, and then it's negative 2's, right? So I need the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. So here's where we're at. The opposite of, I'm going to use a parentheses this time. Would you agree that 3 groups of negative 2 is negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2? And here I'm going to make those plus signs green. I don't need to, but just for clarity's sake. Do you agree that that's 3 groups of negative 2?
Yes.
Negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2? Right? You okay with me? Are you with me? And if not, you're asking, so I'll go back and explain. I want you to know why this thing ends up the way it does. Okay, so we still have out front the opposite of. So I'm going to write the opposite of. And now add up everything in the parentheses. Add up everything in the parentheses. So Aaron, what do you get when you add up the stuff in the parentheses? Just in the parentheses. Just add this stuff up right here. Positive or negative? So negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2 is positive 6? That's what I asked you. What's in the parentheses, right? Negative 6 is what's in the parentheses. So again, I'm not so sure you guys are following what I'm doing here. This negative is right here with these words. That's the negative part. This part here is the rest. This right there. So now to finish it, what is the opposite of negative 6? In class, the answer is? Positive 6. So what just happened? A negative times a negative became a positive. Why? Because I'm doing the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. What's the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2? The opposite of negative 6. What's the opposite of negative 6? Positive 6. We'll do the last example here in just talking through it. So in example B, I want the opposite of 2 groups of negative 10. Do you agree? The opposite of 2. So what's 2 groups of negative 10? What do you get when you have 2 groups of negative 10?
Negative 20.
Negative 20. What's the opposite of negative 20?
20.
20. And the answer is 20. Right? Because it's the opposite of 2 groups of negative 10. That's what's going on. Okay, so boil that down. And we're going to say this. Any negative times a negative is a... By the way, we did that the other day with 2 minuses in a row, didn't we? And now we're doing it in multiplying of numbers. Now look, you have to remember that a negative times a negative is a positive. Now, I didn't bother to give you a positive times a positive, because guess what? That's pretty boring. Positive times a positive is?
What?
You've been doing this since, what's 2 times 4? 8, all right? That's a positive, all right? I didn't bother to give a positive times a positive because we all know 2 times 4 is 8. We all know 3 times 5 is 15. We all know 7 times 11 is 77, right? But you better know that a negative times a negative is a positive. And these are key concepts that you just have to have in your brain and you need to know. So again, the idea is if the signs are different and you're multiplying 2 things, the result will be negative. If the signs are the same, the result will be positive. Now, you can't miss this. You have to have 100% in your head that a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative is a negative, and you've got to have in your head that a negative times a negative is a positive. You can't miss that. Because if you miss it, you're going to miss those problems every time. Right? You have to say the answer in this case is positive, not negative. So when you get to C here, the answer is, class, C is going to be 33. Well, you can't say negative 33. You're going to be wrong. You got to say 33 because this is a negative 3 times a negative 11, and negative times a negative is a positive. So but you got to know that. You can't mess that up. You can't get confused on that because you'll miss every one of those. So D, don't say it yet. Take a look. And the answer to D is going to be 35. Come on, I need everybody participating. Again, in class, you got to be thinking. You're not thinking, you're not learning. All right, so look at E. All right, here we go. On 3, give me E. 1, 2, 3.
24.
24, right? Things, all of those are positive. Okay, so let's finish up with one other thought. What if you multiply 3 or more factors? Oh no. Surely we have no idea what to do. All right, we haven't done 3 or more before. This will be impossible to do, but just let's see if you can get it. Try A. Don't say anything out loud. Go ahead and solve A. Let's see what you get. What happens when you multiply a negative 2 times a 5 times a negative 3? Where do you end up? Hold on, Theodore. Let's give everybody a chance to do it. Come up with an answer for me. What's a negative 2 times a 5 times a negative 3? All right, need everybody participating. On 3, out loud, give me your answer. Everybody participating. All right, normal voice. You don't need to shout really loud because I want to try to hear everybody. On 3, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
30.
Okay, so I think I heard 30 and negative 30. So let's take a look. The way you multiply 3 things is multiply 2 first. Negative 2 times a positive 5 is a negative 10. Do you agree?
Yes.
Now we can multiply a negative 10 times a negative 3, and that's how we end up at positive 30, right? How many got that right? Most of you? Yeah, I heard mostly positive 30s. Makes sense? You know, how do you multiply 3 things? You multiply 2 first, then take that answer and multiply times a third. So how do you do 4? 2 at a time, all right? So go ahead and do that last one. Go ahead and do B. All right, if you got an answer on 3, give me your answer. Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Negative 24.
Okay, I heard a lot of negative 24s. A 25 slipped in there somehow, but that happens. All right. So a negative 4 times a negative 2 is a positive 8. And again, this is what your work should look like. Now I got to do the next two. 3 times 4, or 8 times 3 is 24. And then finally, a positive times a negative is a negative, and 24 times 1 is 24, and you should have gotten negative 24. And how many got that right? I know almost everybody did. Right? Does it make sense? So look, let me just be clear on what to show me for work. On C, D, and E, was there any work to show? No, because it's just, you do that in your head. You know 3 times 11 is 33. You just got to think about whether the answer is positive or negative. But if there's 3 or more to do you need to show me the steps? Show me the steps there. Make sense? All right. Hey, homework is at page 18.